Miguel's phone wouldn't stop vibrating in his pocket while he stood outside conference room B, still holding a mop like it could explain why he was there. His paper cup of Starbucks was cold and half drunk, the lid smeared with a thumbprint from when his hands were shaking. Inside the glass wall, a dozen people in suits stared at a screen full of numbers and a single line of text in a language Miguel recognized immediately. "Come on," a man's voice snapped from inside. "It's one sentence. Translate it and I'll marry you." People laughed. Not hard, not friendly. The kind of laugh that says you don't belong in this room. Miguel swallowed, feeling the sting of bleach on a cut near his knuckle. He looked at the line again, and his stomach tightened because it wasn't just a sentence. It was a warning. A polite one. The kind that could quietly kill a deal without anyone admitting it. The man who'd said it, Mark Heller, the CEO whose name was on the building, turned and finally noticed Miguel. His smile curled like he'd found entertainment. "Well," Mark said, "you're standing there like you know something." Miguel's throat went dry. He thought of the unpaid hospital bill folded in his glove compartment. He thought of his mom's voice trying to sound fine last night on the phone. Then he said, softly, "I do." Miguel Alvarez cleaned offices on the 42nd floor of Heller Global in downtown Chicago. Not the glamorous part of Chicago that tourists post on Instagram. The real part, where the wind cut between buildings like it had a job to do, where the sidewalks were crowded and nobody looked up unless they were about to bump into you. He started every weekday at 5:30 p.m., right when everyone else started acting like their day was over. People stepped around his caution signs without reading them. They talked on Bluetooth headsets like their words were more important than air. They left half-eaten salads and empty coffee cups on the conference tables like someone else's hands were built for cleaning up after them. That someone else was Miguel. He wasn't bitter all the time. He told himself that a lot. But bitterness was a sneaky thing. It lived in small moments. It lived in the way his badge didn't open most doors. It lived in the way his name was printed on a sticker that no one bothered to read. Miguel had moved to Chicago 8 years ago, after his mom got sick and he couldn't keep pretending his hometown job in Indiana was enough. He had been a warehouse loader, then a delivery driver, then, after one too many late payments and a car that started making a noise that sounded expensive, he took the janitorial job because it came with steady hours and health insurance. Health insurance, he learned fast, didn't mean no bills. It meant smaller bills that still make your chest tight when you open them. His mom, Rosa, lived in a small apartment on the northwest side, close to a bus line and a grocery store that didn't feel like a trap. She had rheumatoid arthritis that flared up like a storm system. Some weeks she could make soup and sweep the floor. Other weeks she couldn't hold a mug without her hands trembling. Miguel visited her every Sunday if his schedule allowed it. He'd bring groceries and pretend he didn't notice the way she rationed her pain meds, trying to stretch them like she could stretch time. "You don't have to do all this," Rosa would say, even as she accepted the bags. Miguel would shrug and say, "It's fine," because that was what he always said. "It's fine" meant I can't afford to talk about how not fine it is. He lived alone in a studio apartment in Pilsen. The place was clean, mostly because he was good at cleaning and didn't own much. He had a futon that creaked when he sat down, a small table that came from a thrift store, and a framed photo of him and his mom at Navy Pier from a day when her smile looked easy. There used to be a second photo. Him and his girlfriend, Tasha, at a summer street festival. But after their breakup, Miguel couldn't throw it away and couldn't stand to look at it, so it lived face down in a drawer like a secret. Tasha had told him, gentle but tired, "You're always carrying something, Miguel. And you won't put it down. You won't let me help." He had wanted to say she didn't understand. But she did understand. That was the problem. She had seen him, and seeing him hadn't been enough to make him change. Now his nights were routine. Work. Train. Apartment. Microwave dinner. A quick scroll through his phone that always made him feel worse. People smiling in kitchens bigger than his whole apartment, couples on vacations, old classmates posting about promotions. Then he'd set his phone face down like it had done something wrong. On this Tuesday, the building felt 10 degrees colder than usual, like the air conditioning had been set to intimidate. He rode the service elevator up with a cart full of supplies, trash bags, disinfectant, paper towels, glass cleaner, and a mop that had seen too much. The 42nd floor was quiet except for the low hum of lights and the faint beep of an office phone ringing unanswered somewhere down the hall. Miguel liked this part of the night sometimes. Empty offices felt honest. Desks looked less like power and more like furniture. He pushed into conference room B, the big one with the long table and the wall of glass overlooking the city. He'd cleaned it 100 times. Tonight it was still set up from a late meeting, water bottles in a neat row, a projector remote, a stack of printed packets, and a dry erase marker without a cap. He started gathering trash. As he leaned over the table, his phone buzzed. Not a text. A call. Unknown. Miguel ignored it. Then it buzzed again. And again. Something in his chest tightened. Unknown calls at night usually meant a bill collector or a scam. But sometimes it meant the hospital. He stepped into the hallway and answered, keeping his voice low. Hello. Mr. Alvarez, a woman asked. This is Lakeside Medical Billing. We need to go over a balance on your mother's account. Miguel closed his eyes. I already set up a payment plan. I'm showing it was missed last month, she said, not unkind, just firm. If we don't receive payment by Friday, it may affect scheduling future appointments. Miguel's throat tightened like he'd swallowed something sharp. I got sick, he said, then hated how weak it sounded. My hours got cut for a week. I understand, she said, in the way people say they understand when they can't actually do anything about it. What amount can you put down today? Miguel stared at the grey carpet. He knew what was in his checking account. He knew exactly. He'd looked this morning and felt the familiar mix of shame and panic. I don't know, he admitted. Can I call back tomorrow? There was a pause. Tomorrow is fine, she said. But please don't forget. I won't, Miguel said, because he didn't forget. He never forgot. Forgetting was a luxury. When he hung up, he stayed still for a moment, phone in his hand, the building's cold air drying the sweat on his palms. That's when he heard voices at the far end of the hallway. Not the usual end-of-day chatter. This sounded tense. Fast. A group of people rounded the corner, executives, assistants, and in the center, Mark Heller himself, walking like he owned not just the building but the night. Miguel had seen him from a distance before. Tonight he was close enough to notice details, the perfectly tailored suit, the watch that probably cost more than Miguel's car, the way his eyes stayed sharp even when he smiled. They reached conference room B. Mark glanced at Miguel's cart and then at Miguel, like he was evaluating a stain on a shirt. Why is this room still dirty? Mark asked. Miguel's face got hot. I just got here, he said. I'm starting now. Mark's assistant stepped in quickly. We need the room for a call in 5 minutes. International team is waiting. Miguel nodded and moved faster, hands working on autopilot. He wiped the table, emptied bins, aligned chairs. He worked like speed could erase embarrassment. The executives filed in behind him, talking about terms and counteroffers, and if they walk, we're done. A woman in a navy blazer whispered, their legal team sent a final note, but no one can read it. Miguel froze for half a second, because he caught a glimpse of the laptop screen as someone opened it. The text wasn't English. It was Spanish. And not the kind from a textbook. The kind his mom used when she was scared and trying not to show it. Mark leaned back in his chair, irritated. He looked around the room like someone had let him down personally. It's one sentence, Mark said, loud enough for the whole room. He smirked and nodded toward Miguel like Miguel was part of a joke. Translate it and I'll marry you. A few people laughed. Miguel stood at the side with his mop, feeling every inch of his position in the room, feeling how easy it was for them to treat him like background noise. But the sentence on the screen wasn't funny. Miguel read it again, quietly, and his stomach dropped. Because it wasn't a message about the deal being almost done. It was a line about trust. About respect. About whether they were being played. Miguel swallowed. His heart thumped hard enough he could feel it in his neck. He wasn't supposed to speak. He wasn't supposed to matter. Still, he heard his mom's voice in his head, soft, tired, but stubborn. Don't let them make you small. Miguel took one step forward. Sir, he said, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. I can translate that. Mark turned toward him, eyebrows lifted like Miguel had started talking to the TV. And for the first time all night, everyone in the room looked directly at Miguel Alvarez. The room didn't go quiet all at once. It thinned out, like sound being pulled through a filter. Miguel felt it before he fully noticed it, the way people stopped tapping pens, the way a side conversation died mid-sentence. Mark Heller looked at him for a long second, measuring whether this was a distraction worth entertaining. You. Mark said. Not cruel. Casual. Like the answer was already obvious. Miguel nodded. Yes. Mark glanced at the screen again, then back at Miguel. You speak Spanish. Miguel almost laughed at how small the question felt compared to what it carried. I grew up with it, he said. My mom only spoke English when she had to. A few people shifted in their chairs. Someone whispered, just let him try. Another voice said, we're wasting time. Mark exhaled through his nose and waved a hand. Fine. Go ahead. Read it. Miguel stepped closer to the table. His shoes squeaked faintly on the polished floor, louder than he expected. He leaned over the laptop, careful not to touch anything. The sentence sat there, black text on a white background, simple and dangerous. He translated slowly, choosing words the way you choose steps on ice. It says, Miguel began, that before they agree to anything, they need confirmation that this partnership is based on mutual respect, not just money. They're saying they won't move forward if they feel mocked or ignored. And they're reminding you that silence on this point will be taken as an answer. No one laughed this time. Mark's smile had faded. He leaned forward, elbows on the table. That's not what our team summary said. Miguel swallowed. Sometimes summaries miss the tone. The woman in the navy blazer frowned and looked back at the screen. Is that accurate? She asked, not to Miguel, but to the room. Miguel felt heat rise in his face. He wasn't used to being questioned like this, not by people who could decide things that mattered. It is, he said. They used formal language, but it's still a line in the sand. Mark stared at the sentence again. Then he looked at Miguel. Really looked at him this time, like he was trying to solve a puzzle instead of dismiss one. How do you know? Mark asked. Miguel hesitated. This was the part where he usually backed down. Where he said I think or maybe and let the moment pass. He thought of his mom, sitting at her small kitchen table, translating medical forms with a dictionary because no one bothered to explain them to her. Because, Miguel said, I've seen this kind of message before. When people feel like they're being talked down to, they don't shout. They get quiet. And they give you one last chance to notice. The room stayed still. Mark leaned back, fingers steepled, eyes unreadable. Well, he said finally, that's inconvenient. A couple of people chuckled, but it sounded forced. Mark turned to his assistant. Pull up the rest of their email thread. The original language, not the translation. As the assistant worked, Mark looked at Miguel again. What's your name? Miguel, he said. Miguel Alvarez. And you clean this floor, Mark said. Miguel nodded. Yes, sir. Mark didn't comment on that. He looked back at the screen as the emails loaded, scrolling, reading more carefully now. The mood in the room shifted from irritation to focus. 10 minutes passed. Miguel stayed where he was, hands clasped in front of him, mop abandoned by the wall. He felt out of place and hypervisible at the same time. Finally, Mark sighed. He's right, he said. We missed this. The woman in the navy blazer exhaled sharply. If we don't address it directly, they'll walk. Mark nodded. Draft a response. Acknowledge the concern. No legal fluff. He paused, then added, and run it by Miguel. Miguel blinked. Me. Mark gave him a sideways look. Unless there's another bilingual cultural expert hiding behind the coffee machine. A few people smiled, small and uncertain. Miguel felt something loosen in his chest, then tighten again. This wasn't a win. It was a test. They worked through the response line by line. Miguel pointed out phrases that sounded polite but empty. He suggested simpler wording. Honest wording. At one point, he said, That sentence sounds like you're doing them a favor. They won't like that. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're saying I should apologize? Miguel nodded, heart pounding. For how it came across, yes. Not for the deal. For the tone. The room waited. Mark considered it, then nodded once. Fine. When the email was sent, there was nothing to do but wait. People checked their phones. Someone refilled their coffee. Miguel realized his own cup was still sitting on the counter, untouched since before the call from the hospital. After 20 minutes, Mark's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then smiled. A real one this time. They are staying, he said. They want to move forward. A quiet ripple of relief moved through the room. Mark stood and straightened his jacket. Good work, he said, then looked directly at Miguel. You included. Miguel nodded, unsure what to do with that. I should get back to work. Mark paused. No. Sit down. Miguel hesitated, then took a seat at the end of the table. It felt wrong, like wearing someone else's coat. Mark looked around the room. We talk a lot about global strategy, he said. About understanding markets. Turns out we're not as good at understanding people as we think. He looked back at Miguel. Where did you learn to read between the lines like that? Miguel shrugged. When you grow up translating for someone you love, he said, you learn fast that words aren't just words. The room was quiet again, but this time it felt different. Not tense. Reflective. Later, as Miguel rode the train home, his phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Mark Heller. I'd like to talk more. Coffee tomorrow? Miguel stared at the message as the train rattled through the dark. His first instinct was to say no. To keep his head down. To not complicate things. Then he thought about how close he'd come to staying silent. He typed back, okay. The train slowed. Outside the window, the city lights blurred together, and for the first time in a long while, Miguel didn't feel invisible. Miguel almost cancelled the coffee. He stood in his apartment the next morning, staring at his phone like it might accuse him of something. The text from Mark Heller sat there, unchanged. A location. A time. A cafe in River North that Miguel had passed 100 times without ever going in. The kind of place with clean wood tables and prices that made you pause before ordering. His first thought was practical. He couldn't afford it. His second thought was worse. He didn't belong there. Miguel showered, put on his cleanest jeans and a button-down shirt he only wore to funerals and job interviews. He noticed a loose thread near the cuff and trimmed it with his keys. On the train, he kept replaying the night before, wondering if he'd said too much. Wondering if this was just a temporary curiosity that would fade once Mark returned to his real world. The cafe smelled like roasted beans and citrus cleaner. Miguel arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window, where he could watch the street and feel less trapped. He ordered a small coffee, black, and tried not to think about the price. Mark arrived exactly on time. No entourage. No assistant. Just a dark coat, slightly rumpled hair, and the same sharp eyes, now tired around the edges. Miguel, Mark said, extending a hand. Thanks for coming. Miguel shook it. Mark's grip was firm but distracted, like his mind was already somewhere else. Saturday. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence wasn't awkward so much as unfamiliar. Miguel realized most of his conversations were either rushed or transactional. This felt like something else, and that made him uneasy. I won't keep you long, Mark said. I know you have work. Miguel nodded. I start at 5. Mark studied him. I did some digging, he said. Not in a creepy way. HR stuff. You've been with us 3 years. No write-ups. Perfect attendance. Miguel shifted in his seat. I try. You're overqualified for your job, Mark said plainly. Miguel felt a flicker of irritation. With respect, he said, you don't know that. Mark didn't bristle. He leaned back. Fair. Then tell me. What do you want? The question landed heavier than Miguel expected. He stared into his cup, watching steam curl and disappear. I want, he began, then stopped. He'd never said it out loud before. Saying it felt like tempting fate. I want stability. I want to stop feeling like one bad month could ruin everything. Mark nodded slowly. That's most people. Miguel looked up. Then why does it feel like the system's built for the opposite? Mark's mouth tightened. Because parts of it are. They talked longer than Miguel planned. About language. About how meaning gets lost when you flatten it for convenience. About how Mark's company had expanded fast and sometimes forgot that people on the other side of an email weren't abstractions. Then Mark asked, why didn't you say anything sooner? About the translations. About the tone. Miguel hesitated. This was the question he'd been avoiding. Because, he said, I learned early that speaking up can cost you. And silence costs you slower. Mark absorbed that. I was a jerk, he said suddenly. Last night. The joke. It wasn't funny. Miguel shrugged. I've heard worse. That doesn't make it okay, Mark said. Miguel nodded, but the knot in his chest tightened. This wasn't just about last night. It was about years of swallowing things. About being told, directly or not, that his place was to clean up after decisions he never got to influence. Mark leaned forward. I want to offer you something. A role. Consulting, at first. Language and cultural review for international partnerships. Paid. Miguel's heart kicked hard. Too hard. I can't, he said immediately. Mark blinked. Why not? Miguel laughed, short and humorless. Because people like me don't just step into rooms like that. Because if I fail, I don't fall onto a safety net. I fall through. Mark frowned. Everyone risks failure. Not equally, Miguel said, sharper than he meant to. When you fail, it's a setback. When I fail, it's eviction. The words hung between them. Miguel felt exposed, like he'd peeled back a layer he usually kept protected. Mark was quiet for a long moment. I won't pretend I understand that, he said finally. But I hear it. Miguel nodded, but hearing wasn't the same as fixing. They parted politely. Mark said the offer stood. Miguel said he'd think about it. On the train home, Miguel's phone rang. His sister's name flashed on the screen. He answered, already bracing himself. It's Mom, she said. She fell this morning. She's okay, but they want to adjust her treatment. It's going to mean more appointments. Miguel closed his eyes. The familiar weight settled in his chest, heavy and immediate. I'll figure it out, he said, because that was what he always said. That night at work, Miguel moved through the 42nd floor like a ghost. He cleaned desks where people had left family photos and motivational quotes. He wiped fingerprints off glass walls where deals were made that shaped lives he'd never see. He thought about the offer. About the fear that came with it. About how staying where he was felt safe and unbearable at the same time. At midnight, he sat alone in conference room B, the city lights blinking beyond the glass. He took out his phone and looked at the hospital bill again. The numbers didn't change. They never did. Miguel realized then that the breaking point wasn't loud. It didn't come with shouting or dramatic gestures. It came quietly, with the understanding that doing nothing was also a choice, and it was costing him more than he could afford. He typed a message to Mark. Deleted it. Typed again. I'm scared, he wrote. But I don't want to stay invisible. He stared at the words, then hit send. The room stayed quiet. The city kept moving. And Miguel sat there, waiting, knowing that whatever came next would change things, not perfectly, but permanently. Mark replied the next morning with 3 words that didn't sound like a pitch or a promise. I get it. Miguel read the message twice while sitting on the edge of his futon, shoes still off, socks mismatched. Outside, a garbage truck groaned down the alley, the sound of normal life refusing to pause for anyone's turning point. He waited for the follow-up that didn't come. No pressure. No deadline. Just space. That unsettled him more than urgency would have. They met again a week later, not in a boardroom or a cafe that made Miguel self-conscious, but in a plain conference room with bad lighting and chairs that didn't pretend to be comfortable. Mark explained the role slowly. Contract-based. Clear hours. A number on paper that made Miguel sit back and breathe out without realizing he'd been holding it. "This doesn't fix everything," Mark said. "It's not a rescue. It's work. And you'll disagree with me sometimes." Miguel nodded. "I already do." Mark smiled at that. "Good." Miguel kept his janitorial job at first. Partly out of caution, partly because letting go felt like tempting something fragile. He worked evenings and consulted during the day, reviewing documents, sitting in meetings where people sometimes forgot he was there until he spoke. When he did, the room listened. Not always comfortably, not always gratefully, but they listened. The first time someone rolled their eyes at one of his comments, Miguel felt the old instinct flare up, the urge to retreat. Instead, he took a breath and said, "If you don't want my input, say so. But if I'm here, I'm going to be honest." The room went quiet. Then someone nodded. The meeting moved on. At home, things didn't magically smooth out. His mom's health stayed unpredictable. The bills didn't disappear, they just stopped feeling like an immediate threat. Miguel helped Rosa adjust her medication schedule and sat with her during appointments, translating not just the words but the tone, the intent. The doctors listened more carefully when Miguel asked questions. Rosa noticed. "You talk different now," she said one afternoon, stirring soup slowly. "Like you believe they should listen." Miguel shrugged. "I'm practicing." He and Tasha ran into each other at a grocery store near his apartment. The encounter was awkward but kind. They talked about work, about mutual friends. Neither apologized. Neither needed to. "You seem steadier," she said as they stood by the freezer section. "I'm glad." "So am I," Miguel replied, surprised to find it was true. 3 months in, Miguel quit the janitorial job. He did it respectfully, thanking his supervisor, leaving the locker clean. As he handed over his badge, he felt a tug of guilt he hadn't expected. That job had carried him through years he wasn't sure he could have survived otherwise. On his last night, he cleaned conference room B one more time, even though it wasn't his assignment. He wiped the table, straightened the chairs, and stood by the glass wall looking out at the city. It didn't look different. He did. The deal that started it all closed quietly. There was no public announcement tying Miguel's name to it. No viral headline correcting the joke. Just a line item in a quarterly report and a shift in how future emails were written. Miguel didn't become a symbol. He became a person with a slightly better margin for error. One evening, months later, he sat at his small kitchen table, laptop open, reviewing a document. His phone buzzed with a reminder to pay a bill. He paid it. Then he closed the laptop and sat there for a moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. He thought about how close he'd come to staying silent. About how fear had dressed itself up as practicality. About how change hadn't arrived like a wave but like a series of small steps he almost didn't take. Miguel didn't believe in fairy tale endings. He believed in mornings where the weight felt lighter. In work that didn't erase you. In speaking up even when your voice shakes. Before bed, he texted Mark a simple update about a document. Mark replied with a thumbs up and a thanks. Nothing dramatic. Just normal. Miguel turned off the light and lay back, the city noise drifting through the window. Tomorrow would bring its own problems. It always did. But tonight, for the first time in a long while, Miguel felt something solid beneath him. Not certainty. Not safety guaranteed. Just the quiet relief of knowing he hadn't stayed invisible.